Hey, what's going on, guys? This is Joey McKenzie here, again from joeymckenzie.tech, here with another edition of, I think we're going with the rename now. We'll be going officially by, I think, for the time being, between two brackets. So again, just small bite-sized segments of daily developer tools, frameworks, languages, ecosystems, just kind of exploring what's out there. And we'll walk through, some sort of simple setup, and just kind of see what a tool gives us or what a language gives us. Maybe walk through an ecosystem feature, et cetera, et cetera. So today I wanted to do something that I haven't really done yet, at least in the Rust ecosystem, but I do everywhere else, my day-to-day job, on some side projects and whatnot. And that's with working with the HTTP client reqwest, which seems to be one of the more popular, if not the most popular HTTP client request library for Rust. So I've been doing a lot of work lately, kind of updating my blog, integrating with the Twitter API so I can kind of pull my most recent tweets. And I thought today would be a fun exercise of using reqwest to kind of build that same workflow. So what we'll be doing today is just building out a really simple application that will interface with the Twitter API, and we'll be doing some really basic authentication. No pun intended, we'll literally be doing basic authentication. And then we'll be pulling my tweets from my timeline. And so again, these will all be HTTP requests out to the Twitter API. So we'll be making, getting a post call, we'll be, authenticating, going out, telling Twitter, slapping request parameters on stuff, all that good stuff that we want to see inside of an HTTP client library. So I very briefly have used reqwest before. So again, it's kind of meant to be more exploratory and just to kind of see what the reqwest library gives us. So let's jump into some code here. So first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to spin up a brand new project here. So let's go with a cargo new, and again, this is Rust based, so we'll be using some Rust code here. So I'll spin up a Rust or a cargo new, let's make this a binary application. We'll call this the Twitter request sandbox. I'll go ahead and I'll let that spin up. One sec, I'm going to swap out my keyboards here so I'm not pounding away on a mechanical board. Okay, so I've got my cargo project spun up, my Rust project spun up, so I'm just going to go ahead and open this in VS Code. So this will be Twitter request sandbox. Let's see, so this opens for me. Cool. So we'll drag this window over here. Okay, so this is going to spin up. So I've got my file. So again, just kind of a really simple scaffolded out Rust project here. And in terms of Rust extensions, the only one I've been using lately is the Rust Analyzer. So it seems like in the last couple of weeks or so, the official Rust plugin and the Rust Analyzer have merged. So it seems that the Rust team has now taken over, or the Rust programming language team has taken over ownership of Rust Analyzer. So I'd highly suggest using Rust Analyzer. It will help you write a lot better Rust code and just kind of help guide you along the way. Okay, so let's get started here. I'm going to bring in a few project dependencies so I can kind of help facilitate some things here. First and foremost, let's actually go and check out crates.io. And if you're not familiar, crates.io, this is just the crate registry for all kinds of different Rust packages. So very similar to NuGet and .NET or NPM in the JavaScript, TypeScript ecosystem. So I'm going to go and grab the request crate. So I'll go search for that, first one that pops up. So I'm going to jump in here, and really all I need is just these two guys right here. So just request and Tokyo. And Tokyo is the async sort of library runtime for Rust. This isn't really a video on what Tokyo is. Maybe we'll go into that a little more in depth in another session here. So I'm going to head back to my playground here, sandbox. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to drop those dependencies in there. And so Rust Analyzer is going to run, Cargo Clippy is going to run, make sure everything compiles and works accordingly. Another crate that I'm going to use just to kind of help facilitate some request constants, all that type of stuff, I'm going to use lazy static. So I can just have sort of lazy initialization of static variables. So I'll go grab this guy. So I'll drop in to my Rust project here, to our sandbox. So we'll drop in, and this will be lazy static, and we'll just pin it to that version. Oh, whoops, already have it for me. So I don't need any of that. Okay. Next, I'm going to bring in Surday, so I can sort of deserialize the models that Twitter hands back to me in a sort of sane fashion. So I'll bring in Surday, and we'll just go grab the latest feature there. So let's drop into this guy, and we do actually need some features from Surday. We need the derive feature, so we'll be deriving the deserialization trait on our response structs. So let's see, where is that? Okay, we'll grab that guy. So let's head back to our Rust project here. So I'll bring in Surday, and let's actually pin it to just kind of a version 1. Doesn't really matter here what minor version we use. And then I also want to bring in the derive feature. So that'll be available on my structs. I also want to bring in mvlog just so I can kind of briefly see. I mean, we could just print out to the console as well. But I like mvlog. It's just kind of nice, simple log implementation for Rust. I've been using tracing a lot, and I've been using tracing in some of the Rust side projects I've been doing, but we don't really need super in-depth, complicated logging as of right now. Although I would highly recommend that if you are going to do sort of anything with Rust, tracing is a great logging crate to check out. For our purposes, really simple. We're just going to use mvlogger. So I'm going to go ahead and grab mvlogger as a dependency, and then I also need to grab log as a dependency. So I'll drop into here. Okay, cool. So let's head over to Rust, or my main program here. So I want to async this with Tokyo, because I want to use some of the async offerings that request brings me. So first thing I'm going to do is, let's call this a Tokyo main. Whoops, not token main. So let's call this a Tokyo main function. Okay, and let's go ahead. Right. So let's go ahead and just kind of get some boilerplate out of the way here. So we're just going to have this return a result, just an empty tuple. And then I'm also just going to return any error that is handed back to me. I really don't care what the error is in our case. So I'm just going to pass in a dyn error. So a box, and again, I'm not a Rust expert by any stretch of the imagination. This will be an async func. Okay, so I am, again, not a Rust expert by any stretch of the imagination. So there are much smarter people than myself that will do a lot better job at explaining everything that we got going on here. But box, again, is just a placeholder for sort of any dynamic object that we want to pass in that we might not know the size of at runtime. And Rust is, again, a very strict language in terms of static typing and whatnot, which is why I've kind of fallen in love with it, coming from the .NET world. So let's get some boilerplate again out of the way. So let's just return an OK function at the end here. Okay, cool. So if I run this, I shouldn't see anything happen in the console. It's just going to download all my dependencies, all that good stuff. Nothing's going to happen as of right now. So while that is running, let's actually head over to Postman. And so we'll actually take a look at some tweets here. So this is the Twitter API. And so in the user, or in the URL here, so I'm calling out to the Twitter API. There's no current Rust client for the Twitter API. So again, we're just kind of doing a interacting with their REST API via HTTP. Not a big deal. So this is my Twitter user ID. If you're interested in seeing what your tweets are, you can go grab your Twitter ID by just doing some simple link investigation of the actual tweets. And then I'm going to grab my tweets and I'm just going to return the latest 5. So in order to do that, we do see that I have an authorization token here, and Twitter does require that you do register in their developer portal. Again, I've already done this, so I'm not too worried about, I'm not going to go through the whole thing again, but if you guys are interested, they have great documentation on how to sign up, how to register applications for projects and whatnot, client IDs, all that type of stuff. So we'll preface, you are going to see my current client IDs, and if you want to use them, go ahead, but I'm probably going to revoke them after this video. So hopefully for the hackers out there, won't be that valuable for you. So, okay. So in order to sort of facilitate these 2 API calls, these are the 2 API calls that we're going to be making. So first we're going to go authenticate against the Twitter API. We're going to hand them our client ID and our client secret. And this is just simple OAuth. I'm just going to say, hey, Twitter API, this is who I am. I'm a registered client. I would like to access your API. They're going to hand me back a token, a bearer token, and then I'm going to pass that bearer token along to all of my tweets, or to the request to get my tweets. So that way Twitter can obviously verify, oh, okay, well, this person is a verified user. They're in our system. So they handed me a bearer token that's valid, hasn't expired yet. So I'll let you, here's your data. So the first call we're going to be making is to this OAuth 2 endpoint, and we're going to pass in the client credentials, because again, I am passing in client credentials. This isn't a video on what OAuth is. OAuth is an entire spec in and of itself, and there are much, much, much smarter people than myself that will do a much better job at explaining all the different request flows and grant types that are involved in OAuth and whatnot, et cetera, et cetera. So you'll see here, I've kind of done some basic authentication here. So when we do basic authentication, just real quick, what we're going to do is we're going to hand a base64 encoded version of our client ID and our client secret in a basic authorization header. We're going to hand that over to Twitter. Twitter's going to verify that base64 encoded string, see that it matches the client ID and client secret that they have registered. Hopefully know that it's me. And client credentials are more or less falling out of style now for PKCE and sort of other more less, I guess I should say, attacker-prone grant flows and grant types. So they'll know it's me, and they're going to hand me back this access token with a token type. And what we're really concerned about is just grabbing this access token so I can pass that down to the user tweet timeline ID. And this is the direct Twitter API, the direct Postman collection that you can get from the Twitter API documentation. It's available, generally available, so I didn't build any of these except this token call. Cool. Okay, so now that we've got kind of our boilerplate out of the way, let's head back over to the code here. Okay, so I ran my code, nothing happened. So we probably want to make some stuff happen here. First thing I want to do, I'm just going to initialize my logger. So, and again, this is all in the, if we head over to crates.io, it's all here. Initialize your logger and then just start info logging. Super simple. Really no hidden nooks and crannies, no special initialization that you need for the most simple implementation of a Rust logger. So I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to init, and then I'm going to drop in here. I'm going to say info, and then hopefully Rust Analyzer will pick that up and say, hey, you need an import here. I think I did just see it, so I'll import that. And I'll go ahead and I'll say, just real quick, hello world, just to make sure all my logging is up and running. Now, when I run my program here, so if I were to run cargo run, I haven't set a log level. Again, Rust requires that if you want to see log messages for certain crates or packages, you need to set what the base log level is. I'm not telling it any sort of base log level, so I'm not going to see these logs in the console. So what I need to do is say, I need to pass in an environment variable, the Rust log environment variable. I'm going to pass that in as info, so the base or sort of the lowest log level I'll be able to see are at least info logs. So now I'll run a cargo run, and I should see hello world. Okay, cool. Sweet. So again, I just get some nice, pretty colored info for me, and everything's working. Awesome. Okay, so again, I handed back a result. Or I guess I should say, instead of box dine standard error, we could also use anyhow error. I've been using that in Rust projects lately, and that's kind of been helpful. Again, if we're not really concerned about what type of error we get back, if we just want to pass up some contextual information about the error up to the caller, that's probably a more vetted Rust crate, but just a simple box error works for our purposes here. Okay, so let's actually start working some stuff out here. So let's make some simple notes. So first thing we're going to do is we need to instantiate a client, so a request client, request HTTP client, and we're going to reuse that HTTP client to make the authentication call and then also the timeline call. Next, we're going to authenticate. So we're going to authenticate with the Twitter API, and then we are going to call to get latest tweets. Okay, so we've got a few things here. First one we're going to want to tackle is this Rust or request here. So let's go ahead and spin up. What do we want here? We want to new up a new client. Yeah. So let's new up a new HTTP Rust client. So I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to bring in let client, and let's use request. So I got my request namespace, and I want a client, and I'll just again new this up. And there are more sophisticated request building clients and stuff where I can pass in just a base URL and have that client make all the HTTP calls for me if I wanted to. But again, our use case here is super simple. I'm just kind of dipping my toes into requests. So, I more or less just want to see if it kind of does the stuff that I do with other HTTP client libraries in other languages. Cool. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's spell out a log here. So we'll say info instantiating Rust client, or not Rust, request client. Okay. And so now, and again, there's awesome extensions that will just kind of continually compile your code and whatnot and make sure it runs in Rust. I'm just going to do it the good old manual way here. So I'm just going to run a cargo clippy. Again, we're just making sure everything runs. I don't have any obvious errors in the code. That's Rust Analyzer telling me, hey, everything looks good. So I think you're okay to go. Okay. So first thing we want to do is let's dispatch an info log, and we'll say authenticating with Twitter API. Again, just kind of giving contextual information into, I can kind of see into the brains of my application here, what it's doing and when it's doing it. So let's bring this over here. Let's bring Postman over here. Okay. So I want to call this endpoint here, this HTTP, or this OAuth 2 endpoint here. So both of these calls do require that I just have HTTP //HPI or api.twitter.com as my base URL. And so this is where I'll bring in lazy static to just kind of take care of some constants for me. So I'll bring in just a few things here. Let's bring in static ref. What are we going to need? So let's do a Twitter API base URL. And this is just so I don't really have magic strings floating around my code here. I can just kind of keep them in one place. Twitter API base URL. This will just be a static lifetime string. And this will be https //http api.twitter.com. Okay. Next, I want my client credentials, and this is the part where, again, I'm probably going to rotate these, so don't get too excited if you want to reuse my IDs here. And I actually have some code snippets printed out for me, so I can save myself some typing here. So again, lazy static, I'm just lazily instantiating some strings, so allocating the space for these strings when I need them. when I actually call them. Whoops, missed a bracket there. Okay. So here's my API key. Here is my API secret. Okay, so let's make the call to now go get my authentication credentials. Well, authentication credentials are going to return a response here. So if I send this request, I should get a response back. So this is going to be a structure or just some JSON that I'm going to get back. And I want to type this JSON. So this is where we're going to bring in Surday. So with Surday, use Surday, I'm going to go ahead and bring in deserialize. And I'm just going to quickly spin up this struct here. So this will be a derived struct, which will derive from serialize. And this will be a struct. And we'll call this auth response. And auth response hands back a token type. I don't really need the token type here, so I could probably just leave this off and tell Surday not to deserialize it for me, or tell Surday not to deserialize it for me. Not important. What's important is the access token. So we will need that. So this will be a string. Okay. And let's actually go ahead and just debug this. So that way I can just quickly info into the console and just kind of see, the response I got back from the authentication call. So let's go ahead and we'll say let auth endpoint. So this will be, let's format a string here. So this will be a string where I'll have my, let's dereference the Twitter base URL. Okay. It's not just the base URL. It's also all of this stuff that I'll need. So this will be, cool. So I'll have my Twitter base URL, which will be HTTP, so api.twitter.com. And then I have the rest of the URL here, which is just the endpoint, and then some parameters that I'm going to pass in, some query params that tell Twitter what grant type I'm using to authenticate here. Okay, so that's my auth endpoint. So when we actually call this guy, I'm going to call let's call this the auth response. So I'm going to take my client, and we are going to post to my auth endpoint. Okay. Now I want to attach, again, some headers on this. And luckily for us, reqwest has some really nifty helper methods. And one of those helper methods is basic auth. So this will just create the header that I need. And again, I could do this manually myself if I really wanted to. If I wanted to create like a request struct or a request initialization object, I could pass that into my client, with headers and whatnot. And headers, again, are just string maps. Just boilerplatey stuff that I'm sure we've all written, and we're ready to move on with our life with the helper method. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to pass in my username. So this will be my client secret or my client ID. So this will be Twitter. Let's see, do I get IntelliSense here? So this will be my API key. And then this takes an option. So I'll pass in some Twitter API secret. Okay, cool. So I've got making a post call. I've attached some authorization headers for basic authentication. All right, so let's actually go ahead and send this now, because this is really all I need. So I'm going to send this, and send is going to return a future. So I'm going to need to await that. And now if I were to just await this, I would just get a response back. So just an HTTP response that would have HTTP metadata, about like the status code, some text information if I needed it, maybe some errors or all that good stuff. There will be content attached to this response here, and that content will be in the form of JSON, which is a buffer. So I'll have to sort of wait on that buffer to come down to the client, and then I'll have to turn that into an actual model. So now, luckily for us, there are more helper methods with reqwest here. So I like to think of this as, if you've had any experience with maybe like the fetch API with Node or JavaScript, this feels very similar to that. And so that's kind of why I've been exploring it lately. So here I'm going to await my response. I'm then going to turn said response. Well, I'm not going to return. What I really want is just the JSON that is returned from that response. And I'm going to typecast this into an auth response. And now if I didn't if I got something else. So say like if I were to not, maybe give the right grant type, I would get back a different response code. And so I could actually, turn this into, these could be optional serialized parameters here if I really wanted to, make sure that I was at least just getting a response back and I'm not really concerned about what the status code is, right? But if I were to not get what I expected back, this is where I'll get the errors, and those will just propagate back up. And we'll be able to see in the console, what happens if, we don't get what we expect. Okay, so again, I do have to wait. This is going to return a future. It's a buffer that I have to read from. So we'll do I'll wait, and then again, I'll just propagate any errors back up to the caller here. Okay, cool. So now, in theory, I do have an authenticated response, and let's just info out into the console here, auth response, and then since I'm deriving debug, I'll just go ahead and print my auth response out. Normally, it's probably a better idea to actually implement like a display trait rather than debug, but our simple use case, we just want to see what this thing looks like. So now if I go ahead and run this code, so we see some stuff here. It's just going to warn me about, I'm not actually accessing anything. This is going to be Surday setting these fields for me. So I see instantiating request client, authenticating with the Twitter API, and I do get a response back. Okay, so this is what I expect. I get the token type, I get an access token. There's my access token. Okay, cool. So I've got an access token now. And actually, I don't really care about what that bearer is there. I'm just going to go ahead and say, if I've made it at least this far, I know I haven't propagated my errors up thanks to the question mark operators here. So really what I'm concerned about is just the access token. So if I were to run this again, I should just see, let's actually do this. Access token. Obviously, probably not the best idea to log out access tokens inside of our logging mechanism. So I would not suggest you do this in a production environment or any sort of real world environment. Again, this is purely just us exploring here. Cool. Okay, so I've got an access token. So now let's make a call to get my latest tweets. So I'm going to head back over to here, and there's some information that I'm going to need. So this is just, some auth response, all that type of stuff. I use a tool every now and again called, let's go JSON to Rust. And this will just take basic old JSON stuff and you'll see I was doing this a little earlier. So, whoops, let's see. Okay, so it's spinning, yada, yada, yada. It's going to spit out some Rust structs and hopefully use Surday. Can't remember if this uses Surday or not, but I use JSON formatter on a day-to-day basis. Really helpful tool, really handy. Let's see, looks like it's stuck here. Okay, so let's go JSON to Rust. Hopefully this will work. All right, whoops, I had two in there. Okay, so now, cool. Okay, so I've got data, meta, so I've got some structs sort of panned out for me here. And again, it's going to put all this metadata on here. I don't really need a lot of this stuff here, so I'm just going to quickly use these just to drop some models in. Okay, and so I'm not using the token type, so I don't really need that. And actually, and I also don't need the serialized trait because I'm not serializing these. I'm only deserializing them. So I can get rid of that. Okay, so there's that. All right. Okay, don't love these names, so let's rename these to, let's call this the Twitter timeline response. Okay. Datum, this is just my tweet stuff here, so don't really like datum as a name, so let's call this tweet meta, just tweet metadata. And then the actual meta here, so let's call this the timeline meta. Okay, and this timeline meta just gives me a token to go grab the next paginated response, tells me the ID of the newest tweet, the ID of the oldest tweet. Again, just general metadata about the actual tweet response here. Don't need any of these renames here because I'm not renaming them. These are literally what the nodes are called. So I'll go just remove those. All right, cool. So now, and again, added a bunch of stuff. If I was normally working with a tool like Trunk or just something to keep my code running and compiling, I wouldn't have to do this. But again, in the case of learning Rust, I think it's always helpful to just kind of make small code changes, compile your code, make sure everything works. Just because, one of the things about learning Rust or getting into Rust is the compiler is very strict, but that's for a good reason. Okay, so everything looks like it's working, running as is. And so actually I didn't get anything out into the console, so let's actually run this again. And so, okay, everything still works. We're all good here. All right, cool. So I've got my access token now. I've got the models that I want to deserialize information out into. So let's make another API call here. So let's call this the let timeline endpoint, and this will just be the endpoint that I'm going to use to go grab my latest 5 tweets. So again, I'll use Twitter API version 2 here. And so let's format a new string. So I'll format a new string. This will be Twitter API base URL. Oops, not that. Twitter API base URL. And then I'm going to add the rest of the URL onto this formatted string. And so you'll also see here max results. I can also probably turn this, and actually I haven't tested with this yet. So let's actually get this up and running first, and then we'll slap some query params on. Cool. Okay, so now save that. So now if I jump down and I say let timeline response equals, and again, I'm going to reuse that same client. So that same HTTP client. So now I'm going to be making a get request, and this will be my timeline endpoint. And then I'm going to have, again, bearer authentication in this case. So in my authentication response, I was using basic authentication, which is part of client credentials. You can go read the OAuth spec and what it is and whatnot. Now that I have a token, the bearer token, meaning I've authenticated, this is who I am, please let me access your resources. So there's a nice helper method where I can use the bearer auth. And again, all this is doing is just doing some request initialization, creating a hash map behind the scenes, slapping an authorization header on there, handing in or formatting this bearer token string for us. All stuff we could do by hand, but we don't need to because request is pretty awesome. Okay, so I'm going to pass in my token. So let's call this auth response. I'll call this access token. Okay. So now I'm going to drop into the console. So let's go ahead and send this request. And again, this is going to return a future. So I am going to want to await that. Same principle applies here. I'm going to get the HTTP response sort of metadata. So information about the response. I'm just going to get some buffers back that I can read from in terms of content types. So what I'm really interested in is the JSON on this HTTP response. And I'm going to deserialize that JSON out into Twitter timeline. Whoops, Twitter, what do we want here? Yep, Twitter timeline response. Okay, and again, I'm reading from buffer, so I'm going to wait that. Okay, so I'm going to wait that. All right, so now in theory, I should have a timeline response. So if I drop into the console here and I say info timeline response, I should see, whoops, not that, timeline response, and then we will print debug these. Okay, then I'll pass in my timeline response. All right, cool. And I can debug print these because my Twitter timeline response does inherit from timeline. Oh, and it might actually be telling me it doesn't. Okay, yes. So let's head back up to here. I want my Twitter timeline response to derive from debug, which means everything that is included in the nodes of my timeline Twitter response also need to derive from debug. All right. So now, in theory, if I were to run this, so I'll rerun this. Let's actually clear the console out so we can see this a little better. So I'll rerun my Rust program here. So it's going to give me some warnings about debug. some fields that aren't used, yada, yada, yada. Okay, so then we're instantiating our request client, authenticating, we got an access token. Okay, and we have a response. So we do have a JSON response here. Well, not a JSON response, a struct response. But I can at least see that I'm getting my tweet text back. So I see my latest tweets here. So like here's, this tweet ID. Here's me tweeting about NGRX, which is an Angular state management library. All that stuff. So this is all what I'm getting when I actually look at this stuff in the in Postman. Cool. So I've got some stuff here. I don't love attaching this query param in the literal string here. So let's actually pull this out, and this will be new. So I actually haven't messed too much around with query params. Let's see if there's anything built in for us. So we can add bearer auth. Let's see if there's a query. So let's see, we've got modify the query string of the URL. Okay, so now I've got some examples here where I'm going to hand in a reference to a vector of it looks like just string tuples. So let's do that. So let's pass in, we'll call this query params. Let's let this equal, query params. Let's just have this be a new vec. And this will be, we'll call this max results. This will be 5. Okay, and so this should, string. Okay, good. So I can pass in by reference, query params, and actually I think I can just take ownership of this here because I'm not really going to even use this later. Let's see if what happens when I save that. Okay, so it's complaining, didn't like that, so cannot find, oh, gotta put a let there. Let, okay, and then I just want to cargo clippy because I do see an error there, and I'll get a little more. There we go. Okay, so I do have to pass by reference. That's okay. Okay, so now if I cargo clippy again, let's see if everything is okay. Awesome. All right, so let's go ahead and clear the console here. I'll go back to wherever my timeline endpoint was. Okay, and I removed that. So now this is quite literally just the endpoint, and I'm going to slap some query params on the end there. So I'm going to go ahead and rerun this program with my info logging. And I should see the same thing that I got when I originally ran this program where I had the query params included in the string literal. And I do. Okay, awesome. So I see all of my Twitter stuff coming back. We're working with query params with requests. We're using bearer authentication. Cool. All right. So I think I'm going to call it there. Again, just a quick little exploratory sandbox of what request is and how we might use it to call external APIs in a Rust context. I can't wait to use this in some side project eventually. I'm really excited and hope this helped anyone who's interested in digging more into request or Rust. Until next time, see you guys.